Good evening. Welcome everyone to the July 2022 meeting for the City of Troy Zoning Board of Appeals. Welcome to all of our guests who are here tonight and my fellow board members. I'm Mike Bossenbrook. I'm the chair of the board. We have, I guess, 4 of my colleagues who are here, potentially one more who is hopefully on his way. We'll just get started, and if he joins, he'll just join at that time. We do have one of our alternates, Mr. Forster, who is standing in for one of our normal board members. And again, welcome to everyone else who's here. With that in mind, we have our agenda for tonight. So let's begin with our first item, which is the roll call. So if Mr. Paul Evans, who is our liaison from the planning department, if you could call the roll for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Green. Mr. Desmond.
Here.
Mr. Eisenbacher.
Here.
Mr. Forster.
Here.
Ms. Malala-Holly.
Here.
Mr. Bossenbrook.
I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Evans. Now let's move on to our second item in our agenda, which is our statement of procedure, which is kind of the rules for how we hear and handle our cases. And Mr. Eisenbacher, who is our vice chair, will go ahead and read our procedure for tonight.
Okay, thank you. The Zoning Board of Appeals is a group of 7 of your neighbors appointed by Troy City Council to decide on requests for variances and other matters that are brought before them. A variance is a relaxation of the literal provisions of the zoning ordinance. Petitioners must indicate a hardship or practical difficulty with the land that would warrant the granting of the variance. Procedure. The board will hear the items in the order they appear on the agenda. When an item is called, the chairperson will verify that the petitioner is present. Then the city administration will summarize the facts of the case. The petitioner will then be given an opportunity to address the board to explain the justification for the action requested. After the petitioner makes their presentation and answers any questions that the board may have, the chairman will open the public hearing. Any person wishing to speak on the request should raise their hand, and when recognized by the chairman, come up to the podium. The speaker should identify themselves with name and address, indicate their relationship to the property in question, for example, next door neighbor, live behind the property, etc., and state whether they are in favor of or against the variance request and give reasons for their opinion. Comments must be directed through the chairman. Comments should be kept as brief as possible and closely pertain to the matter under consideration. Only one person will be recognized by the chairman to speak at one time. At the conclusion of public comments, the chairman will close the public hearing. Once the public hearing is closed, no other public comment will be taken unless in response to a specific question by a member of the board. The board will then make a motion to approve, deny, or postpone the request. In order for the request to pass, a minimum of 4 votes are needed. If the request is not granted, the applicant has the right to appeal the board's decision to Oakland County Circuit Court.
All right, thank you, Mr. Eisenbacher, for reading our procedure. We'll move on now to our third item, which is the approval of the minutes from last month's meeting from June 21, 2022. If there is any discussion on the minutes, or is there otherwise a motion to approve the minutes?
Just a point of order, the actual statement reads minutes of April 19th, 2022 within our document here. I don't know how relevant that is, but.
Let me double check that. I guess the copy that I have on my computer says June.
Oh, well, I'm reading one that says April 19th, so disregard that,
Signature one that matters if you have the folder.
It says June 21. So,
Okay.
All right,
Mine
no problem.
would be older.
Not sure why that would be. So did June 21, any motion to Mr. Eisenbacher to approve?
Seeing no comments for corrections, I will move for approval.
Second? Mr. Forster, we have a second. I think we're ready for a vote. Mr. Evans?
Mr. Bossenbrook,
Yes?
Mr. Desmond,
Yes.
Mr. Eisenbacher,
Yes.
Mr. Forster,
Yes.
Ms. Malala-Holly.
Yes.
All right, now we have our meeting minutes approved from last month. We'll move on to item number 4, which is the approval of our agenda tonight, which has been printed out for us. There's a copy out in the hallway. Unless there's any discussion from members of the board, we'll go ahead and finalize our agenda for tonight. Not seeing any discussion, so we'll go ahead and consider tonight's agenda to be approved. And that will then bring us to our 5th item, which is our hearing of cases. We have 2 items on our agenda tonight. So we will start with a variance request that is for the property 5789 Endicott. And we'll start with, if Mr. Evans, he has a presentation for the board. And whenever you're ready, Mr. Evans, go ahead and take over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a variance request for, the correct address is 5979 Endicott. There's a typo in the agenda itself, but we did double check, and all the other documents related to this do have the correct address. So this is a variance to construct a home addition 25 feet 2 inches from the rear property line, where the zoning ordinance requires the proposed addition be 35 feet from the rear property line. Now, the subject property is outlined in red here in the bottom of this aerial, and this property is south of Square Lake and east of John R. And I'll keep zooming in. Subject property, as indicated in yellow, is zoned single-family residential. As you can see, the majority of property in this slide is zoned similar. And there's a close-up of the property. And I've circled an area in the rear of the property where the next slide will show the area of the variance and the proposed addition. So this is their survey that they've submitted, their site plan, and it's turned 90 degrees. So up here, this is the back of the property, Endicott's down here. This is the house, and this is on a survey, it's indicated as a deck area, but the hatched area is where the proposed 3-season room, sunroom addition is going to go. Now, they call out a setback of 25 feet 2 inches. In looking at the zoning ordinance, you may see that the section cited, 4.06, actually requires a 40-foot setback. Well, that is correct, but I don't want to say unique, but with this subdivision, as with many subdivisions that were platted in the early and mid-'70s, they were platted under an option in the zoning ordinance called subdivision open space. And what that allowed is, within a particular area that encompasses the entire subdivision, a developer would be allowed to perhaps have reduced size lots or reduced setbacks. But the overall net result would be no additional residences within that entire platted area. Now, the trade-off with that is that the developer had to provide some sort of open space, dedicated open space. So this is one of those subdivisions, and the setback that was required for this approval was 35 feet. So that's why in the ordinance it says 35 feet, but maybe if you look at the zoning ordinance or somebody were to look at it, it says 40 feet for this zoning district. So they're requesting a setback variance in order to add on a proposed 3-season room, and this is just indicative of what they propose. Your agenda packet has additional information as to how the finished result is going to look. I'll turn it back over to the board for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Any member of the board wish to be recognized for questions for city staff at this point?
I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Malala-Holly.
So, Mr. Evans, thank you for addressing that point that I had made earlier via email. So, am I correct in my understanding then that some lots could be smaller because the developer was providing more open space, and so some lots could be smaller when these kind of subdivisions were built? Is that how I should understand it?
I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case with this particular subdivision. I know there are a number of options the developer could use. Quite honestly, I just didn't look that closely at the approval beyond the rear setback, so I just don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. At this point, I will ask the applicant for, again, it's 5979 Endicott, the applicant or their representative, if they would like to come forward to the podium. And if you could just identify yourself for the board and your relationship to the property. We obviously have the written materials that was provided and appreciate that. And feel free to direct your comments to the statement of practical difficulty and those sorts of things. So go ahead, thank you.
Okay, I'm the contractor, Mark Malloy, 55 East Long Lake in Troy, and I'm representing All Season Sunrooms Plus.
I'm Susan Schwab. I'm the owner of 5979 Endicott Drive.
Welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. So if you have anything you'd want to talk to the board about, feel free. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, she's requesting this due to the fact that which Paul has already stated here, when I look at the overall subdivision, the perimeter homes look like they were pushed back to the overall boundary of the subdivision. It was one of the few or only homes that had that kind of a setback there compared to other homes on the interior of the sub. And I don't know if that's just because of the plotting, but I thought the difficulty would be that the homes behind her, that front John R. had plenty of space there, and I believe there's some kind of easement there. So due to that fact, I was hoping that the board would recognize that and grant this variance.
Can I say something?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. I had submitted a map that also, it's a City of Troy map, that showed the acreage for those homes behind me. And I share like two backyards just because of the way the property goes. But they both have 0.64 acres. And both of those homes are built way towards the front of the road. So they have got tons and tons of backyard space there. The way that the one has put up trees and stuff, I barely at this point can see the back of his garage. The other one, I don't see any of the house just because there's so much shrubbery and trees and stuff there. So I would not be encroaching on their vision or anything like that because they don't even see my deck. And this is going like right where my deck is. I'm asking for a foot more instead of 10 feet to at least have 11 feet wide, because without this, I can't do anything. I cannot, without a variance, I can't do a gazebo. I could not even do a retractable awning. I can only go out 5 feet according to Paul Evans if I had a retractable awning. I can't do anything in my backyard. There's nothing I can do to get shelter from the sun, to be able to be out there and enjoy my yard, like even if it's raining. I don't know, I was just hoping you guys would do it. I'm probably saying something I'm not supposed to, right?
I mean, it's your time to speak, so, and if they have questions.
We appreciate both of you coming here and presenting your appeal. If there's any member of the board, if you're finished, well, I think the board may have questions. Any member of the board want to ask any questions of our applicant? Mr. Forster?
Yeah, thank you for coming in. You talked about the difference between a 10 and 11 feet addition. What difference will it make if it is that extra foot? What's the square footage difference?
Well, it's we're doing 11 by 18. I guess we could go wider, but generally in the sunroom industry, I'd like to go 12 foot as a very standard projection. I told her, you know, you could ask for it. They may not allow that, but she was willing to settle for 11 feet. When you get in any 10-foot room, if you think of your home in a 10-foot room, it gets a little tight as far as trying to lay furniture out and what have you. So I think, is the deck that's there now 10 foot?
It's 10 feet.
Yeah, so we were asking for that additional foot to go 11. Like I said, a very standard projection in the sunroom industry is 12 foot.
I would have preferred 12 feet, but I didn't want to be greedy. You know, I thought maybe I had a better chance if I only asked for 11 as opposed to 12.
All right, thank you.
But if you'd like to give me 12, I'll take it.
Anybody else? Mr. Forrester, thank you for that question. Any other members of the board wish to be recognized? Mr. Eisenbacher?
In terms of the hardship that goes with the land, it is the smallness of the property then.
Mine and the one right next door to me, because it was built by, they were the last two probably in the entire sub that were built, and the same builder built both properties.
Okay,
So, yeah, it is the smallest. It's like 0.24, I think, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Any others? Members of the board?
I have one more, excuse me.
Yes, Mr. Forrester.
So these two neighbors that you back up to, are they aware of what you're going to do or what you would like to do?
I assume that the city sent them notifications.
But you haven't talked to them or asked them if it's okay?
No, like I said, we don't see each other because of all the bushes, and their houses are pushed way forward than what mine are. I used to talk to the one when his bushes weren't big and we'd see each other in the yard, we'd say hi. But
Okay.
I don't even actually know their name.
Okay, thanks.
I have one question. Is it possible to build a sunroom in the existing without asking for a variance?
Well, it would only be 5 feet from the house, 5 foot out, the projection. She's asking for a 5 foot variance. She's got 5'6" or 6 foot. Is that correct, Paul? And we need that additional 5 or 6 feet to make it 11 feet. So we're asking for a 6 foot variance, I believe.
5.5, I think.
Yeah,
something
5.5
like that,
feet
yeah.
to get an 11 foot projection. So.
Okay, I think unless I don't see any other questions from board members, so thank you again for coming up here and being brave. Feel free to go back to your seat. I think we'll bring this back. You maybe come back a little bit, but at this point, I will open the public hearing portion of this appeal, and I guess I'll start with Mr. Eisenbacher. I know we have one written email that was presented to the board, and Mr. Eisenbacher, if you could go ahead and read that for us or give us a summary.
Yes, we received one email related to this property, and I will read it. It says, "Hi there, my name is Steph, and I live near Susan, and was sent a public hearing notice about her request for a variance. I live at 2092 Oakwood Drive and have no issue with this. Susan takes amazing care of her front yard and is a considerate and friendly neighbor. I feel that her house is unfairly set back from the sidewalk, so she should be given the extra space to add on a sunroom or whatever structure she's looking to put on. Please let me know if you have any other questions, and thank you." And that's Steph Bullock. Looking at the map, she is 2 houses over in front, so her backyard looks at the front yard of the property in question.
All right, thank you, Mr. Eisenbacher. No other written correspondence, and I'll just ask if there's any member of the public here who would like to step forward. If you want to speak to the board, you don't have to. It's your call, but if you would like to speak to the board and address any comments about this property appeal, feel free to step forward. You can identify yourself, your relationship to the property, and we'd be happy to hear your comment.
Hi, my name's Linda Leslie. I live at 2080 Topaz, which is kind of kitty corner from Susan. And we've been neighbors for like 35 years. She's always taken wonderful care of her yard. And it is unfair how set back her house is to where even when she had her deck, she has her deck, it's very small. She can get a swing on it, maybe a chair. 10 feet is not that big. And I can't even imagine putting a sunroom that size. It would be really nice if she could have 11 feet. 12 would be wonderful. She's also lost her husband a year ago, and, it would be a really nice thing for her to have, just to enjoy. She loves being outside, and this would be somewhere where she could enjoy her yard and her flowers, and we love her in the neighborhood, and she's a great neighbor, very helpful, and it would be nice if you could help her this time, so. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I don't see any other public comment, so I'll close the public hearing at this point. And we've heard from the applicant, we've had public comment, and now I'll bring it to members of the board for some discussion or any action that members of the board would like to take. Does any member of the board wish to be recognized? Mr. Forster?
I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Evans, if I could. You said earlier in the presentation that this subdivision was allowed to have some smaller setback because the builder had other public space.
Right, subdivision open space, yes.
And so when they do this, does that affect in any way, shape, or form the original setback? So this setback is less than the original 40 feet setback. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so we're asking then to make it 12 feet or 11 feet less than that.
Right. Then the 35 feet that's in effect for this subdivision.
Okay, my next question is, do pools account for the setback? Is that not part of the setback?
No, that's a separate regulations.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
I got just a comment here. This is my neighborhood. I live on Bingham, right down the block, so I'm pretty intimately familiar with it, and several of these lots are irregularly shaped. Not this particular lot, but the rest of the lots south on Endicott are. Also, looking up in the public record, a considerable number of these lots along Highbury, Rutgers, Topaz. This is one of the few that is 120 feet deep. There are a couple that are, but the majority of them are larger, anywhere from 121 to 125. So just a comment that it's not really out of keeping for the rest of the neighborhood. If it was a neighboring lot, she would have had the space to probably get away with this without getting a variance. So seeing how, I guess the placement of this lot in comparison to the rest on Endicott, it really does kind of give this particular lot and the lot immediately north kind of the shaft as far as what they can do with their yard. So I don't know if that actually counts as an irregularity, but as far as the rest of the neighborhood, it's not that out of whack. And my house even has one of these Four Seasons rooms on it. I'm within the setback, but right up against it. So it does seem like she's got a little bit of a unique dynamic with where she's placed compared to her neighbors based on the others around. So it's my 2 cents. It doesn't seem like it's too far out of the asking relative to the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Desmond. Ms. Malali?
Thank you, Chair. Reading through the reasons that we use to either approve or deny, I'm looking at this particular property, and with the understanding that has been given and, of course, all the information shared, I feel that pretty much all 5 of them, according to me, is hit with this property, especially so that this is not of a personal nature, not created by her or the previous owner, and definitely this is something that this particular lot came with a smaller size. So a deck or a sunroom, any of these things will require variance. And a 10-foot deck, I completely understand doesn't have the required space, and she already has less rear setback. So to my understanding, I think all the 5 characteristics are pretty much met with her request. That would be my comment.
All right, thank you. Any other member? Mr. Eisenbacher?
I agree with my colleagues that stated that basically it looks like all of the 5 criteria are met. The one thing we do need to review is the extent of the variance. From a practical standpoint, sunrooms come in certain sizes. As the builder said, 12 foot's a standard. That's what fits couches and other furniture for practical use of a sunroom. I don't have a problem with, here, I'm trying to find exactly where in the letter it said they had a 10-foot deck, looking at 11-foot sunroom, but 1 foot of difference, given the layout of that neighborhood and the setback of the neighbors, won't be a big difference. So I would be very open to a 6.5-foot variance. From a practical standpoint, since we had an application for 5.5, is it within our procedures and process to grant a 6.5, or are we limited? That's a question to staff.
Thank you, and I think you are limited because,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, so with that limitation, because it was published as a 5.5, and that's what was informed to the neighbors in the listing, I will move a resolution to approve the variance as requested, given a brief summary of the 5 criteria.
Mr. Eisenbacher, can I just
Yep.
I don't know, Mr. Evans, I don't know if just, since we have a motion potentially pending, could you put the template up on the screen? Just in terms of articulating whatever criteria
H2.
Mr. Eisenbacher wants to articulate for the
Yep.
board.
Yep, so it's 25 feet, 2 inches from the rear property line. The applicant has demonstrated, A, the exceptional characteristic for the property is the smallness. B, characteristic which makes compliance is related to this property. It's not some other location. C, it's not of a personal nature. As stated by another board member, it's very common to have a sunroom on houses throughout the city of Troy. D, the characteristic which makes compliance was not created by the current or previous owner. And E, the proposed variance will not be harmful or alter the essential character of the area in which the property is located. We had 2 neighbors give positive feedback for this variance, and it will not cause negative ramifications through the rest of item E. And for those reasons, I would move for approval.
We have a motion from Mr. Eisenbacher. Do we have a second on the motion?
Second.
Mr. Desmond, second. Okay, do we have any further discussion?
I did have one question. Can we just get some full clarity on the address? I'm seeing in the variance request, the address is 5789 Endicott. That number does not actually rectify in the public record. What shows up in the public record is 5979 Endicott. I just want to make sure we're dealing with the right address when this stuff gets signed.
Yes, definitely. The only typo is actually in the agenda. Everything else, including the public hearing notice, is the correct address.
Is the 5979 address? Okay, all right. Just wanted to verify that before you got an approval for a property that wasn't yours, potentially.
Okay. So we have a motion pending. I don't know that we have any further discussion. I guess I will just put my thought into this. This is one of those that's always, I think, very difficult, for me to think about because I appreciate the presentation. I think lots of what has been said is accurate. I can see the practical value of this sort of addition. And I have no doubt that the applicant is a wonderful neighbor and resident of the city of Troy. When I'm looking at the evidence and the characteristics that we have to look at to determine whether there is a practical difficulty, I can't see what is exceptional about the property. I guess, first of all, I think just looking at it, it looks very similar to all of the other parcels in that neighborhood. Yes, there are some that are larger, but it doesn't seem like it's exceptionally different. Not every property obviously is exactly different, but the way that first criteria is worded, I think it needs to be some substantial difference that we have to observe. I don't necessarily see that in the parcel itself. And when we grant a variance, we always have to look to the property and not necessarily the person requesting it. People may want a certain variance and it may be a good ask for the person, but we again have to go to the property itself. So I don't see anything with the property that would warrant the variance. For the second, that is obviously is related to this property. And I think the third one, I think this is what we sometimes see, something of a personal nature. It's tied to the fact that it's not necessarily a characteristic of the property. Mr. Evans described the circumstances in which these sorts of parcels may have been constructed because there may be open space. This was a determination by the builder or the original owner to build the property and place the house where they placed it. And so for characteristic D, again, I think the way it's worded, it's not just the previous owner. We have to look at the current or a previous owner, including a builder or the original owner of the property. And sometimes there are decisions made about what type of house you want to build, where they want to place it, and that's kind of carries with the land going forward. I don't disagree that, again, E I don't think is something I would disagree with, but as I have to look at all 5 characteristics, having to have evidence of all 5 to grant the variance, I don't see that here. Puts me in the position of not being the most popular person in the room, but I think that it's not the type of variance that we would want to see that travels with the land. So appreciate my colleagues' thoughts on this. I will not support the motion. I just wanted to put that on the record. So unless there's any other comments from members of the board, I think we're ready for a vote. Mr. Evans, and this is a motion, Mr. Eisenbacher, to approve the variance, seconded by Mr. Desmond for the various reasons that were put on the record.
Yep.
Mr. Desmond.
Yes.
Mr. Bossenbrook.
No.
Mr. Eisenbacher.
Yes.
Mr. Forster.
Yes.
Ms. Malalahali.
Yes.
All right. We have 4 votes in favor, and that carries the motion. So your variance is granted. Thank you, ma'am, and for coming out. We appreciate that. That will conclude our presentation for the 5979 Endicott. We will now move on to our second property tonight, variance request, which is for 8183 Haldane. When Mr. Evans is prepared to present.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the subject property is located at 81-83 Haldane. This is a request to replace a portion of the 25-foot wide Canham right-of-way with a 40-foot wide private road easement. The resulting easement will result in the existing duplex being set back 9.6 feet from Canham, where the zoning ordinance requires it to be set back 25 feet. So this is an overview map of the neighborhood. The subject property is outlined in red. This neighborhood is south of Square Lake and west of Livernois. It's at the corner of Haldane and Canham is the road that potentially could be vacated. I'll continue to zoom in. Now the subject property and the neighbors to the west and south and northwest are zoned RT, one family attached, and the property to the east is zoned office, and the property to the north and east is zoned neighborhood node. That's currently an apartment complex. And I've zoomed in closer to give the board an idea of the configuration. Now this line here and this line here represent the existing 25-foot wide Haldane. The applicants provided some engineering prints showing the existing right-of-way, also the proposed right-of-way in this print. I shouldn't say right-of-way, if the vacation is approved, a 40-foot wide easement. And this figure here represents the 9.6 feet from Canham Drive, which is this here, that would represent the new setback for the existing duplex that's on this corner. And as indicated earlier, they're required to have a 25-foot setback from Canham, which I believe is existing right now. Now, just a little background on this. The 25-foot half right-of-way that Canham is right now doesn't meet our current city road design standards, but the same ordinance that contains those also prohibits half-streets, which this could qualify as one, because a typical right-of-way today is at least 60 feet wide. So an option under the city development codes is to allow a 40-foot wide private road. So that's how we come up with the 40 feet, and that's how we determine the setback if a 40-foot wide road easement is indeed accepted by the city. You may recall that, at least those of you that were here, I believe in April of last year, we heard a very similar matter for not this property, but the vacant property immediately south on Canham. So in case this sounds familiar to some of you, it is familiar, but the actual variance request at that time was for a proposed duplex on the vacant property to the south, but it was for the same applicant. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'll turn it over to the board for any questions, and I know the applicant's civil engineer is here as well to help out.
Ms. Malaholly for city staff.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question about this because I live pretty close to this property that is here today in front of us. The duplexes face Haldane Road, correct? And the Camden Road is the one that sits off of Haldane Road, which is currently not a paved road. And the reason why the petitioner is requesting is to also look into constructing the vacant land sitting south of the duplexes. So the setback request, the setback that is going to be impacted if a 40-foot wide road is to be constructed is going to affect duplex number 81. In the packet provided, I did not see anything from duplex number 81 owners about the potential impact of their property. Am I correct? And any kind of information that maybe the petitioner has gathered in terms of eliciting feedback or concern or anything like that.
Concern from the neighbor or feedback from the neighbors?
Feedback from especially property 81, because the setback is going to impact their lot.
Well, they are,
Petitioner owns that property.
Yeah, the petitioner owns that corner property.
Okay,
property
it
81.
is the petitioner's property. Okay,
Right.
I stand corrected then. Okay.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Just for my clarification, 81 and 83 are the two units of the duplex, right? It's a single building, those are the two units?
Right.
Okay.
I have one question, Mr. Evans. So just to understand the sequence, if the variance were granted, then that would clear the way for then the private road? This has to sequentially happen first, I guess would be my question.
Well, I don't think there's any, we've had multiple meetings with the applicant, and that's a question that came up among staff and the applicant. What order do things need to go in? What's better to, so you've got a street vacation that needs to occur, dedication of a private easement that would be 40 feet wide, along with acceptance of a constructed private road, but then because they decided to propose the easement where they're proposing it, now you've got a setback impingement upon the existing duplex. So I'm not sure if it's stated, we're pretty confident it's not stated entirely clearly in the law what should go first. But those are the three things that'll need to happen. So for example, if somebody were to come in and say, we want to vacate the street, the natural response from the city might be, well, you need to provide a 40-foot wide private road. Well, then what happens with the variance? So in theory, I guess it could have gone in a different order, but really those three things need to happen.
And then this is maybe a question for the petitioner when they come up here, but if the objective is to construct something on the vacant parcel, they would also need at some point to ask again for the variance for the vacant property, is that?
Well,
I mean, and again, if I'm treading on a question that you think should go to petitioner, I'll save it.
I guess it would depend, I don't guess, it would depend on what they wanted to put on the vacant parcel, and if indeed, and that might be a good question for the applicant, if they look that far ahead to see if you cause another need for a variance on the vacant. So
Okay.
probably should let them address that.
All right. Any other questions for city staff at this point,
I
Mr.?
do have a question. I understand that we're specifically talking about a variance for the setback relative to the size of this private road. Is it within our purview whatsoever to be debating what's to be done with this road itself? Or is that outside of the scope of what we're dealing with in front of the board right now?
Well, can you enumerate when you say what is to be done with the road?
Well, I mean, for when we got a request from Maryland Rail here, who lives at the end of Canham Road, and she has questions about who maintains the road and if that's going to be widened or modified or anything like that. And we're not really, are we addressing anything that will be done to that road? Or is this just a granting of a variance for units 81 and 83?
Just the granting of the variance, because those regulations are outside of the zoning ordinance.
Okay. And that's on planning?
Planning, engineering, yes.
All right, just checking. Thank you.
Seeing no other questions for city staff. Thank you for that, Mr. Evans. At this point, we will ask the petitioner or their representative. Feel free again to come up to our podium, and if you could state your name and your relationship to the property, and remember to try to speak into the microphone as best you can so we can pick it up for the record and for the board members.
Sure. My name's Greg Bono. I'm with PEA. I'm civil engineer for the project. We're 1849 Pond Run in Auburn Hills is our company address.
Welcome.
This is my client, Mr. Rathka.
Yeah. My name's Roy Rathka. I own the property, and Mr. Greg Bono will be, my hearing isn't too good, so he'll be representing me tonight.
Very good. Thank you, sir. Proceed.
So, Mr. Evans, good job kind of laying out the process. Was an interesting question because The variance really kind of ties to the feasibility of whether or not we can move forward with any other items, relative to eventually building a duplex and improving the road, et cetera. So we came and requested the variance first because if the variance is granted tonight for the road, it does allow us to move forward with engineering and planning and all the other elements, that are going to be required along the way. So my client was, this is currently a 25-foot right-of-way. He's not allowed under the current building and, zoning regulations to construct anything on his current vacant property on Canham Drive. So he had received, he had kind of reached out to the engineering department, several years ago. They gave him a letter kind of outlining, some of the things that he would have to do in order to convert this into a private road and then subsequently build on his lot. So, so as a result, would we allow a 22-foot wide asphalt road, shallow ditches and drainage basins would be required. By vacating the existing right-of-way, we would have to also provide easements to the city for existing sanitary sewer, and there's a natural gas line that goes through there. So my client, in order to develop his property, is willing to engage in this effort to vacate right-of-way, propose the private road agreement, pave the road from currently where it ends at Haldane Drive all the way to his south property line, which would be the right side of the screen, with asphalt and 22 feet width. It's currently 10 feet or so gravel, just a driveway for the resident that lives just south of there. So he's proposing to make all these improvements on his own expense. There was some questions about maintenance, et cetera. As part of the language in the private road agreement, my client is willing to be responsible for the maintenance of that section of road as well. So, I guess anything else?
I think that covered it pretty well.
Yeah. We've had, like Mr. Evans said, we've had a number of meetings. We've actually already submitted our engineering drawings to the city engineering department, and they've given us basically a verbal approval, contingent on this variance being granted. So I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys might have.
I guess I'll just ask my question that I just asked Mr. Evans, and that is, so big picture, I guess sequentially, would you also at some point be asking for the same variance for the vacant parcel?
No. So there will be a 25-foot front setback requirement for his proposed duplex that he intends to build. And the building envelope, based on the setback requirements, the structure he would propose to construct fits within all those as it is. So there wouldn't be any other variance needed.
So and I'm going back to the hearing that we had in April of last year. So I guess you're saying there's a modified duplex that would be built on the vacant property that wouldn't necessitate a variance there? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, his I wasn't at the original meeting, but I think his original intent by asking for that variance was just so that visually, the structures, which would then be 3 of them, would kind of all line up as you kind of look down Canham Drive. So by having the 25-foot setback requirement from the new 40-foot private road easement line, would push his proposed building back an extra 15 feet, basically. So, but that's, you know, in terms of the lot dimensions and the structure he proposes to build, it will fit within those setbacks as they currently exist,
Okay.
or would exist with the.
I think you had a question, Ms. Malali.
Thank you, Chair. What about emergency vehicle access? Will this 40-foot road will it suffice emergency vehicle access for the residents for the duplexes that are proposed also that might happen in the future?
Yes, yes. So the pavement thickness and the asphalt, the road specifications are all per the city's engineering department standards.
And what about the neighbor whose house sits down the road? Will they in any way be impacted? In the sense, I know that your client mentioned about maintaining the roads and such, but parking, any other issues that they down the road in the future might have to contend with?
Not that we can see. I mean, I don't want to debate the merits necessarily of theirs, but they stand to, their property benefits also by virtue of the private road being established, the vacation of the 25 feet of right-of-way that's currently across their property's frontage would be theoretically granted to them, and then they would have frontage on a 40-foot wide private road that would facilitate possibly some future development on their parcel should somebody else purchase the property and choose to redevelop it in a similar fashion possibly. It gives some options for them as current owners or future owners of that property that I would think would be beneficial, you know, to have. I mean, the limits of our construction activity will end. I mean, we're proposing a 22-foot wide asphalt paved road that she'll be able to utilize to access her property. So that's definitely an improvement from that standpoint as well. So, yeah, I don't foresee anything negative impacting anybody on the adjacent.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. With respect to our actual statement of practical difficulty, and just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, because it's a little bit different, we're not actually indicating that there's any issue with respect to the parcel itself. This is all a question of the road, and a modification of that road would eliminate the need for the variance. Am I understanding that correctly? Or am I misreading what I'm even hearing? Like, I guess, is the request for the road that is then impeding, that's where the variance is impeding on the property, correct? But I haven't actually heard anything relative to our criteria about the property itself. I just heard about the road.
Right.
Well, so the property itself is currently situated on a non-conforming right-of-way that does not allow for any development or useful of the rights of his land. So, and that's just a function of it being currently on a 25-foot, you know, with right-of-way. So something has to be done in order for that property to be built upon, so.
So the hardship is the placement of the road is basically what you're saying.
The hardship is, the frontage of it being on a road that is of a non-conforming width.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Eisenbacher.
Hello. Trying to figure out where to start. One of our criteria, item D, is the characteristics which makes compliance with the dimensional requirement difficult must not have been created by the current or the previous owner. That was the sticking point last time this item came before the board. Have you explored changing the two-car garage of the existing duplex into a one-car garage to alleviate that setback concern?
So I think whatever you guys are thinking of previously, we're not asking for that type of a variance, and that was with regards to his current undeveloped parcel. You know, the variances was with regards to the existing building's proximity to the proposed private road easement line. So,
Yes, I understand. I
yeah.
was on the city council when this first came before
okay.
the city. The city staff identified that concern to the builder before he built the property, that he'd have a problem with the access to the rear property. So
Okay, I apologize.
The property owner chose where to place the property, which is now causing this hardship because there's not enough room for the road where you are. So it's hard to get through our criteria for the characteristic that makes compliance with the dimensional requirement difficult must not have been created by the current to the previous owner. Is there a possibility to change the current two-car garage into a one-car garage and not have this setback issue?
I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and clearly I was not, part of that
You weren't on the
process early
project
on.
at that time, right?
That's kind of I would kind of look at that as like either a chicken or the egg argument, because however this current building was constructed, that's existing, the property still is on a right-of-way of a public road that is of a non-conforming width. So, if the right-of-way was larger than 25 feet at that time, and then this building issue still maybe occurred, I guess I could maybe see a little bit more of kind of I could see where you're coming from maybe, but just by virtue of the fact that we're on an existing public right-of-way that's been in that current existence for, it's on the
For a long
plat,
time.
the plat that way, yeah, for decades. So
Okay.
that's
The next question is you alluded a little bit, and I don't know if I missed it, the intention for development of the vacant property, is that for a duplex or a single-family home?
duplex.
So
Okay. The property is currently zoned RM.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, it's zoned for duplex.
Yep.
So you have a property design that is conforming to all other criteria with the orientation towards, let me get the street right. I just was looking at it and I lost my place. What was?
Camden?
Camden, yes, Camden. So you can face it toward, so had the first property been built with that same design, we would also have no problem because it would be facing a 40-foot private easement. Okay.
yeah, I guess if they had established that back then.
Known, yes. Okay. Thank you.
Any other members of the board have questions for the petitioner? All right, not seeing any. Thank you for coming up here and answering our questions. We appreciate it. Feel free to go back, and we will perhaps call you back later if necessary. But at this point, we'll open the public hearing, and if there's any member of the public, feel free to step forward. And once you make your way forward, if you just identify yourself and let us know your relationship to the property,
I'm Marilyn Rail. I live at 5865 Canham, and I've lived there 56 years. And my daughter, Linda, is going to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for coming out. And I'm just, I guess for the record, this is, you also submitted this written.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll just, any member of the board have any questions for Ms. Rail or her daughter?
No questions? I'd request that you explain your opposition or support.
Absolutely. Thank you. As you probably saw in the letter that was sent, there are some concerns which have been answered today. Some of them have been. The biggest concern is she has been the only house on Canham that has had access to Canham, again, for 56 years. The biggest concern is, will she have access? Where is the snow going to be piled at the end of her driveway as her access is at the end there? I don't know if you could tell from the pictures, provided. So the biggest, concern is her having access. The other concern is if this variance is granted for the 9.6 feet, from Canham, then is there another variance coming once, if vacating Canham is approved for this potential duplex, as somebody had mentioned, from the variance request last year. It's obviously, her concern is it negatively affecting her property that she has owned, and also having access, public right-of-way and all of that. So, the parking could be an issue if a duplex is allowed to be built there. Similar to, there's Niles that you will see just to the west of her, that there is parking, along those streets. And that's another very narrow road. I don't know the dimensions of that. But that's going to be the concern, is her being able to access, her property. That's the biggest concern of hers. As you had mentioned, this was in the way that Mr. Rathka had built the property there at 83 and 81, that this is now not allowed to, build currently on that vacant lot. So it was with his knowledge the way he built those duplexes. So, is there anything you want to add?
Well, my concern is, where are they going to be able to park on their road there if they build a duplex there? Are they going to be able to park on the road? Are they going to be able to park on both sides? Is that going to be a problem for me getting in and out, or anybody else getting in and out? And I'm concerned about where are they going to put the snow. We've had some good winters, but we've also had some years ago, because like I said, I've lived there 56 years. I can remember putting up snow fencing to keep the snow from getting in the road, But I don't want to be in a predicament that I have all that piled at the end of my road, at the end of my drive. Where are they going to push it? They used to, where the townhouses are, they used to push it over, a lot of it over by the ditch there. There's no ditch there anymore. So that's my concern, and just how it'll affect my property in general, because I'm just gonna be cornered in there pretty much, because there's nothing, there's, the next street over is Niles, and that's all duplexes. And then the office building is in my front, So I really don't have, I'm getting kind of boxed in there.
Can I address something?
Yes, please.
Okay. Canham also runs in front of her parcel. So while it doesn't look like a road, that, it does run in front of her. So if vacating that to Rathka, Mr. Rathka is allowed, does that include? I know the gentleman that just spoke mentioned no, that it wouldn't, and that she would have rights to that, which is, again, in the front of her parcel. But how would that be determined? How, that's another concern.
Mr. Forster?
Thank you, Ms. Rail, for coming in tonight. Have you maintained this road yourself?
Yes.
For the last 56 years?
Emergency.
Oh, wait, let him
sorry.
finish.
It's okay, sorry, I just wanted to, so you have maintained this road since you've lived there?
Yes.
The city has not provided any
Plowed it
services?
twice, I think, or 3 times.
In 56 years?
Over the 56 year.
Okay.
When it got real bad, and I think they felt it
By
needed-
accident, I think.
By accident, I think.
I think the driver didn't know.
Didn't know where, yeah, I think so. Because we put gravel on, as needed
So
ourselves.
you've paid for improvements to this road?
Yes, yeah.
Did you hire like a plowing service or how did, or did you?
Oh, for snow in the winter?
Yeah,
My husband used to shovel, use the snow blower.
Now.
But now,
Her husband is deceased.
my
I'm sorry.
husband passed away. And now I do have, I don't know that it's called a grant, but it's through the city, based on income, that they take care of plowing the road now in my lawn service.
okay.
Question?
Mr. Eisenbacher?
Assuming, okay, the petitioner stated that you can obviously see from the picture of your house and the properties that
Yep.
the road would extend to the edge of his property line.
Right.
Which lines up roughly with almost the end of the dirt road before it turns to go into your driveway.
Yes.
Assuming that you're not allowed to block people in when you plow snow, that's against
Right.
city ordinance.
Okay,
And you can't landlock any properties, so that road has to be open at the end of it for you by city ordinance. The engineering department can get into more of the details, but those are just general things that
Yeah.
I know. Do you believe it would be beneficial for you to have a paved road leading to your house as opposed to the dirt road? And I may say that in the future, the zoning for your property, it allows for duplexes, as you can see, because there's lots of duplexes in your neighborhood now.
Right.
Because of that zoning.
right.
Your property has a higher value to someone to put a duplex in because
Right.
you can have potentially 2 rentals or a house and a rental next door or whatever. So in terms of you being able to develop your property or a subsequent purchaser being able to develop the property, having that road in increases the value because you can't redevelop it without that kind of access.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm asking if,
Can I ask a question in regards to that?
Yeah.
Sorry to answer a question with a question. That's not my intention, but I guess my question to that would be, in a future developer, so if that were the case, or if she were to want to develop, a duplex, then at that point, she would be able to also request vacating of Canham, is that correct?
yes. Yeah, because, obviously you can see it goes all the way through.
Sure.
Right.
And it actually goes beyond, like in that grassy area,
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned. So that was my question is.
Right, you'd have
are
to go
they
through the
going
same
to-
process with the engineering department.
Certainly.
And they'd have to answer like a lot of your other detailed questions about parking and
Okay.
those kind of things, because those are way outside of our scope
Okay.
for zoning board
I appreciate that.
What about?
of appeals.
Okay.
Good idea.
Any other board members?
Any other questions?
You were
have
talking
questions?
about the pavement on,
Well, no,
Would it be-
that's what he's saying, is that vacating it, meaning giving them the rights to it, they would pave it, and he's saying it might benefit you in the future.
okay.
So let's wait and not answer anything
Okay.
right now, just consider it.
I'm just trying to get an
He's trying
understanding of
to,
how
like,
much
help
what
you
you're
to
opposed to
understand.
and
So-
what you would find beneficial.
Yes,
I
I appreciate that.
Thank
We'll
you.
discuss that,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we've have no more questions. Thank you for
Thank you for your
Thank you
time.
for offering your public comment and your
Thanks.
perspective. We appreciate that. I don't believe, well, we have the written correspondence, Mr. Eisenbacher, but I don't know that we need to
Yes,
read it per se. It's a lengthy.
yes, we have a detailed letter from the residents that just spoke in front of us, including a court case that concerned this property from 2006.
Okay. That's the only correspondence written we have, and we have our other public comments. So with that, close the public hearing. And at this point, now we're at the board deliberation stage. If there are any comments or discussion from the board or any potential action, any member of the board would like to be recognized?
Well,
Yes.
I just have a comment. I mean, basically looking, having the property up on Google Earth and looking at development that's happening in that area, as far as keeping in line with what's going on in that neighborhood, I mean, it really doesn't look like there would be any notable difference should this road be paved and developed. I mean, the only player in the game is really this garage. So, I mean, we're talking about a setback that really exclusively affects just that duplex, at least with regard to this, not counting any future development that happens in that southern parcel. But I mean, with the rest of the development that's going right around that area, I mean, I don't think it would even be noticed if this road was paved and it encroached on really the only building that's hanging out there. I mean, the other side of it is a commercial property. Across the street is a whole development. I do have issue with that we don't really have, as far as structuring a motion, I see a very difficult road to structure one according to our criteria, because the lot itself has no real issues. And again, hearing Mr. Eisenbach, he was on the board when this was initially brought forward, which was pretty interesting. You just happen to remember this one. So I don't know, like I can appreciate the need for this, and the movement, the development trajectory of this neighborhood clearly is suggesting this would be beneficial. Marilyn's property, Ms. Rail's property would benefit as far as valuation, at least in my opinion, if that was to be a developable multifamily lot compared to a single family lot. So I don't see the only other neighbor, Mrs. Rail, who would have be impacted by this stands to gain if the property has better access. So, I mean, this one's a little tough. Like it's more of a bureaucratic issue as far as structuring a motion that I don't really see how that would be done, because the parcel itself doesn't seem to have an issue, and it was caused by the previous owner. So, I don't know, I'm a little in the weeds with this one.
Mr. Forster?
I'm going to be in that same place. If we have to use the statement of practical difficulty when we make our decisions, it really doesn't apply to any of these. As I understand it, we're asking for a variance on the 83, 81 properties. There's nothing here that says this. This is really, in my opinion, another part of this government's responsibility to deal with. I think it makes total sense. Although I will say that whatever happens, Ms. Rail has to be protected. She, in a sense, the city has abandoned this road and given it to her to take care of for the last 56 years. And so she's got to, in my opinion, if something good happens here, it better be happening to her too, based on what's going on. But I don't think this is our issue to decide on, based on what we have always been told are the guidelines, and which you kindly remind us of almost every time someone comes in front of us. And I can't make this fit in any way, shape, or form.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Forster. Ms. Lalali?
Yes, in this case, I do have to agree with both my prior colleagues who spoke. The only one that I will say maybe it comes close to my agreement is probably the last one, where it might potentially have no harmful effect. But that being said, I don't see that this is particularly addressing the property per se. So I'm hard-pressed to vote on this one.
I had one question for city staff, and this is kind of way out there, so I apologize in advance. So if Ms. Rail has been basically maintaining this property for that amount of time, is there some level of adverse possession or anything that plays into this kind of dynamic? I mean, she basically has kind of unilaterally been running this road. Did I go too far with that?
You're asking a legal question that I probably shouldn't respond to.
Oh, okay.
Something Ms. Rail could probably talk to a private attorney about. So.
Okay.
Well, we should probably clarify that it's not really a road, it's a right-of-way. So it's a right-of-way for her to access her property.
Which,
it wasn't a platted road.
That's what I'm saying. So at a certain point, I mean...
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Yes.
I too remember this matter because I was one that handled the lawsuit that was referenced. Canham Road was platted as a 25-foot half-street. And the history of that is like back in the 20s and the 30s, what they used to do was they'd plat a 25-foot half-street on one plat and a 25-foot platted street on the other plat to make a 50-foot street, thinking that eventually you'd have a 50-foot road. But at some point, the property to the east was developed and the 25-foot of that plat disappeared, leaving the 25-foot half-street. So it was platted as a public road, but the city never accepted it or never used it. So it technically was platted as a public road, but never accepted by the city.
Thank you for that the background.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So in the future, that southern property, whoever buys it, or if the person currently in ownership of it sells it, this issue is still going to come up that there needs to be a paved road, correct? So that the property south can be developed. Okay. So this issue is potentially something that might reoccur in the future in front of us asking for a variance, or for that matter, to build that area, they will require that paved road to exist. So potentially the neighbor will still have the same situation that she will be facing again. Am I correct in my understanding?
Yeah, you would be correct. I mean, the engineering's not going to allow a private road, though, to be constructed unless it makes sure that there's no landlocked properties, to make sure there's access for emergency vehicles, to make sure it's maintained. So a lot of the concerns, the engineering department would take care of that.
Correct. I'm just going to use the floor to just thank, I'm sorry, I don't want to get your name wrong, so I'm going to make sure that I pronounce it correctly here. Thank Marilyn Rail here for maintaining the road for such a long time. It is your right of way, and of course it's a road too that I'm sure some people at least have used in the past, and you have graciously maintained it for such a long time, including pouring the gravel on that. So on behalf of all of us here, I would like to thank you for that.
So,
Go ahead.
well, I think Mr. Eisenbacher has identified I think, one of the core issues, which is there is a way forward without the variance. There could be a modification to that parcel. It could be costly, but that's not something we're to take into consideration when we grant or deny a variance. That's not a criteria. So there's a way forward to get the private road. I think Ms. Rail provided the Court of Appeals decision that city attorney referenced that I think summarized the issue, which is that this was a decision years ago how to handle these parcels and how to build, and then it's a problem that's now sort of come to us, but we didn't create the issue. And much to Mr. Forster's point, I don't know that this is a problem that we are required to fix. I think there is a way forward, and it's not in our purview, looking at the statement of practical difficulty, the elements we have to weigh for us to grant the variance. So I don't think that the 5 elements have been satisfied by the petitioner. Understand this is a longstanding issue with this parcel. I guess I will go ahead and make a motion to deny the variance request. And I can, in a moment, I guess, articulate the motion, reasons, if there's a second.
I'll second.
Mr. Forster will second. I don't know if Mr. Evans, if you could put that, or template up and keep me honest on how I want to articulate this. So I would move to deny this variance request at, let me get the property name, at 8183 Haldane for the following reasons. First, I do not believe that the applicant has demonstrated any exceptional characteristic of the property. We are largely talking about development of a different property, and as has been mentioned by Mr. Desmond, there's nothing that's been identified specific to this property at 8183 that's exceptional. Narrowness, shallowness, et cetera, any of those characteristics. So I don't see evidence for one. The second characteristic, or the second element, I think this is also not quite there. Again, I feel like we're talking more about the vacant parcel than we are about 8183. So I'm not sure that this variance request turns specifically on this, this parcel. The third element, I think this is of a personal nature. Again, because I don't see it tied to an exceptional issue with the property itself. And then the fourth characteristic, or the fourth element, as we talked about, I think at length, I think this is something that was created by a current or previous owner as to how these parcels were put together, split, and then how the 8183 was constructed. I think that's been demonstrated through previous litigation and previous commentary. And then finally, I think it's maybe an open question whether the variance would be harmful. I think there's been some discussion about this could ultimately benefit Ms. Rail and her property. I can certainly see that, but even if that was satisfied, I don't see this being overall meeting all of the 5 elements that we have to go by to grant a variance. So that would be my motion and the reasons for it based on the record. Any further discussion? Happy to recognize a member of the board. Mr. Forster?
I'd also just say, this is for Mr. Rathka. I understand that you have an investment and you'd like to improve upon it. I just don't think we're the right place for you to do that. I hope there's a resolution for everyone in the future, but for us, we are constrained by our statement of practical difficulty, and we can't make that work, unfortunately.
Mr. Eisenbacher.
This is, like, as I mentioned earlier, this is the third time this item's come before me. First time was as a city councilman, and then second time as a zoning board of appeals person. The building the road, I believe, is the best outcome. The problem is getting there. It helps the existing property that is in somewhat of a state of being a legal non-conforming because they don't have a standardized private road or public road accessing to their property. Not that it hurts, because they basically have a very long driveway currently that's dedicated to them, essentially. And a 25-foot driveway is a lot wider than some houses in Troy. But yeah, I don't see how we could craft, using the criteria that we have for making decisions, craft a resolution to approve that setback with, no matter how good it would be for the potential outcome.
Thank you, Mr. Eisenbacher. Any further comment, or I think we'd be ready for a vote, Mr. Evans? So the motion would be to deny the variance. I presented the motion, Mr. Forrester seconded, so a yes would be to deny.
Mr. Eisenbacher.
Yes.
Mr. Forster.
Yes.
Mr. Bossenbrook.
Yes.
Ms. Malala-Holly.
Yes.
Mr. Desmond.
Yes.
Motion has carried, 5 votes, and so the variance request has been denied. Appreciate our applicant coming out and our public comment. Had a great discussion. We will move on now to our 6th item on our agenda tonight. Any communications, Mr. Evans?
None, Mr. Chair.
And then we will move on to item number 7, our miscellaneous business. We have 2 items that will be subject to discussion. The first is Mr. Motzny, our city attorney representative, has a legal update to present to us on zoning board of appeals matters. So, yes, Mr. Evans.
Mr. Chair, if it's amenable to the board, could I request a 5-minute recess? I know Mr. Motzny's will be in depth, and I don't mind stretching my legs.
That would be a perfect suggestion. So I will adjourn for 5 minutes to let everyone stretch their legs. Then we'll come back for a discussion of legal update. Thank you. We are again at item 7, our miscellaneous business, and Mr. Motzny, whenever he is ready, will give us his,
I'm going to ask Paul to move the slides for me, but I wanted to say off the bat, a lot of these slides are the same ones I showed you a year ago, and I've updated a few. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the old ones, on these questions. I just want to concentrate mostly on the new stuff added. If you have questions, because I know I presented this a year ago and also to some of the newer members less than a year ago. But there are additions to that, so I'm going to concentrate mostly on the new stuff. So if we move to the next slide, one of the things I want to discuss is the Pegasus case, which is an interesting case because it could change how this board decides dimensional variances. It was a case involving the Airport Zoning Act, but it was decided based on the language of the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. And what the case does is it actually may eliminate one of the requirements for a dimensional variance. And actually, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it'll affect this board. But right now, there's an appeal of the case to the Michigan Supreme Court. So right now, it's not applicable, but I'll get into the specifics in a few minutes. If you go on the next slide. So this is stuff you already know. The board has the right to grant dimensional variances, interpretations of the zoning map as the zoning ordinance, and administrative decisions and use variances. Everything requires 4 votes except for use variances, which require 5, and that's because the statute says a use variance requires 2/3 of the board to approve a use variance. And I should say it requires 4 affirmative votes or 5 affirmative votes in order to pass whatever the applicant is seeking. And again, any questions, because I'm going to breeze through these based on the hour and based I want to get to some of the new stuff. If you go to the next one. Again, a variance runs with the land. It's basically an excuse not to comply with the ordinance. If denied, as we learned tonight, you can't request the same variance for another year, since Mr. Rathka, although the variance was somewhat different, it's been more than a year since his last request. And most requests for variances, as you know through your experience, are for dimensional, or what are known as non-use variances. Go ahead, next slide. A dimensional variance should only be granted if it's the minimum amount necessary, which this board discussed in one of its cases tonight. If a smaller variance could be granted, this board should not grant the entire variance that's requested. Why don't you go on to the next slide? So there's 5 criteria. I'm going to spend a little more time on this as we go through the criteria. But a variance under Troy's ordinance should only be granted if all the criteria are met, or all the standards. I know we changed our opening statement to reflect that, because the old statement said something that if you met as many as possible, but that's not the standard. If a variance request does not meet all 5 criteria for a dimensional variance, it should be denied. I think Paul's going to close the door, but are there any questions on just this basic stuff? All right. Paul didn't tell me how to move to the next slide on his. So
You lost your driver.
yeah. But I think we get into the Pegasus case in my next slide.
You left us floating free, Paul. Confused, no one changing slides.
Yes, actually, it's the next slide I want to talk about the Pegasus case.
Right there?
Yes. Okay, this is a new slide, so I'll spend a little more time on it. The Pegasus case talked about use variances and non-use variances. What that court did was they looked at the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and they said that a use variance requires an unnecessary hardship. But a non-use or dimensional variance only requires a practical difficulty. Our ordinance, practical difficulty is not defined by the statute. But what the court said was a practical difficulty does not require a showing that the variance is based on a unique or exceptional circumstance of the land. And of course, we tell you that that's the first criteria you consider. But according to the Pegasus court, if it's only a dimensional variance, there's no requirement for an applicant to prove that the need for the variance is based on the unique or exceptional circumstances of the land. According to that court, that requirement only applies when there's an unnecessary hardship, which is the standard for use variances and not non-use variances. So that's significant because if the Michigan Supreme Court affirms this, we will have to amend our ordinance because then we can't require people to show for a dimensional variance a unique or exceptional circumstances with the land. But because the case is on appeal to the Supreme Court, we still continue to follow that on our ordinance. My guess is that requirement will be reversed, so it probably won't make any difference. but I'm just putting you on notice that that could happen depending on what the court decides in Pegasus when it goes up to the Supreme Court.
So this unnecessary hardship,
Yes.
I don't remember that language.
We do use it in our ordinance for use variances.
For use variance only, right?
For use variances only. So what the court in Pegasus said, if you want a use variance, you have to show an unnecessary hardship, which does require a showing that the need is based on a unique or exceptional circumstance. But for a non-use variance, according to Pegasus, a practical difficulty does not require that showing. So that's just the basis of the case, which again could be reversed by the Supreme Court, may not make any difference at all.
Just out of curiosity, where did practical difficulty come from then?
It's stated in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. They use the term practical difficulty, but it doesn't define what it means. So we've interpreted that to mean that each municipality can determine what a practical difficulty is. But according to Pegasus, relying on some older cases, practical difficulty does not require a showing that the variance is based on a unique circumstance of the property.
Okay, so the 5 criteria that we use are defined by Troy's zoning ordinance,
Right, yes.
not by the enabling ordinance.
Right. Our zoning ordinance says a practical difficulty requires these 5 showings. And so that's how it's defined.
So that could be changed or modified
It could be, depending on what happens.
locally.
Yeah. But if you go on the next slide. But for the time being, the case is not binding on us. So right now, continue to require a showing of a unique or exceptional circumstance with the land itself as a basis for a variance. It's still one of the 5 criteria and will remain that unless there's a change based on the Supreme Court decision. And I think all of you know what exceptional circumstances mean. It could be an unusually large or small lot, a funny shaped lot. It could be a an environmental thing. Maybe there's wetlands on the property, which would be an exception of circumstance. It could be a number of things. And as long as we are still abiding by our ordinance, because the Pegasus case is still not binding, we still have to find that as one of the 5 criteria. You want to go to the next slide?
Can I just ask you a question about that word exceptional? If we all define it differently, does that apply?
No, it's up to the, what's exceptional or unique depends on how this board interprets it. I mean, you interpret the ordinance, so, I mean, what could be exceptional to you might not be exceptional to somebody else.
Right.
But if you're making a motion, you should say, this is the exceptional circumstances based on, you know, on my opinion.
Okay.
Based on the size of the lot or the shape of the lot or whatever you believe meets that criteria.
Thank you.
All right, next slide. I really should have brought my glasses. I didn't realize. Again, the variance must be related to the premises themselves, and I think, you know, somebody comes along and says, I want a variance to build a shed in my side yard, even though the ordinance requires it in the backyard, because all my neighbors have sheds in their side yard. Well, that's basically asking for a variance based on the characteristics of someone else's property, and so that is not a good reason for a variance. I mean, if they meet the other criteria, you could still grant the variance, but if that's the only reason, the variance should be denied. I think you go on. Again, ask any questions if you have any questions, but you go on the next slide. Self-created hardships.
Can we actually go back real quick?
Sure.
Your favorite one?
Yeah, this is the one that I always think about. What exactly is of a personal nature versus, I mean, in a sense, every variance request is of a personal nature because otherwise they wouldn't be in front of us, but that's not what it means.
So what I would say is, you're right. Most variance requests are of a personal nature because it benefits the person. But if that's the only reason they're seeking the variance, then it should be denied. For instance, if they come and say, the only reason I want this variance is because I could make a lot more money selling my property if you give it to me. If that's the only reason for the request, it should be denied. Now, if they come and say that, I can make a lot more money if you grant this variance, but also I have a funny shaped lot and meets the other criteria, you could still grant it. But if the only reason is of a personal nature, and a lot of times we get it, it's because of the person who lives there. They want a variance because they have a disability and they need a certain room that has certain things in it, but that's going to violate a setback. And if that's the only reason for the request, that is a personal nature and it should be denied, unless they can meet the other criteria. Yeah.
The entire reason for a structure is a personal nature.
Right.
It's to be used for human activities, basically, sleeping, eating, living, working, recreation. I mean, so if they're generally personal use that's common, then I see that as a common personal use, as opposed to like, I can't climb stairs, so I can't have a duplex, or I can't have a second floor or a basement, or if it's specific to that person, or, but then we have like wheelchair access, which ties in with certain disability criteria. How does that tie in?
Well, if they're asking for the variance because they have that disability, and that's the only reason, it's technically of a personal nature, because the variance runs with the land, and the next property owner may not have that disability or need the variance. I mean, again, it has to be based on the circumstances of the land itself, at least for the time being.
Okay.
All right, go on to the next one. Self-created hardships. And there's a number of ways that it could be a self-created hardship. For instance, what we have sometimes is they go ahead and they build a structure without getting a permit. And code enforcement says you just violated the ordinance because you needed a setback variance. Obviously, that's a self-created hardship because they built the structure in violation of the ordinance. But in that particular type of case, a variance could still be granted if they can meet the other criteria. And the way to look at that particular situation is to look at the property as though they didn't build the structure without a permit, like it wasn't there. Would you have granted the variance had they come to you ahead of time? But the other type of self-created hardship is like we had tonight, when somebody divides or partitions the land in such a way that they make compliance with the ordinance impossible. If the applicant or the previous owner is the one who divided the property to cause the problem, that's a self-created hardship that requires a denial. Now, I mentioned the Pegasus case again in this slide because there is actually some criteria in the Pegasus case that actually probably will not be changed based on the law it relied on. The Pegasus case indicates that when you're talking about a self-created hardship because of somebody splitting a lot or dividing the land, you only go back to whether or not that split or division occurred after the enactment of the applicable ordinance. Because, for instance, I know somebody will ask me, well, technically, if this land was platted in the 1920s, and they have a small lot in the plat, because isn't that technically a self-created hardship because a previous owner platted the lot? It would not be. It's only if the self-created hardship only occurs if the division or subdivision is made after the enactment of the particular ordinance that they're seeking the variance from. I know I don't know if I said that right, but basically you don't have to go back all the way to the plat. You go back to a division that occurred after the most recent ordinance. Does that make sense to you? Mm-hmm.
So if there's a parcel in Troy that was legally platted, but it's small,
right,
that would be a hardship because it was under a previous ordinance? If it still existed unchanged from like 1920, before the city existed.
I guess if there's been no other land division, technically I guess you can say it was created by the previous owner. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I don't know what point I'm trying to make. The Pegasus case refers to a time provision that the self-created hardship only applies if the division was made subsequent to the present ordinance.
Okay.
So it's probably not as complicated as I'm making it sound, but that aspect of the Pegasus case probably won't be changed because based on the case law that was applied to making that determination. So even if Pegasus is reversed, that's probably still a good aspect of the case that would probably stand. So
that's, well, like the case we had in front of us this evening.
Yeah.
Five platted properties were combined into 2 properties.
Right.
But that was done after the zoning ordinance and per the zoning ordinance, so he created two properties and there's no hardship because those were created by the applicant.
Correct. Yeah.
Let me ask you, just for clarification, I think I know this, but is it the previous owner or a previous owner?
Our ordinance says any previous owner for dimensional variances. For use variances, our ordinance only applies to the previous owner.
Okay, all right.
I think we've discussed that in the past as to whether or not that's a change we should make, but right now, that's what our ordinance provides. All right, Paul, next one. Again, this is, a variance should be denied if there's evidence of that the variance, if granted, would be harmful to the area, if it's going to cause an environmental problem, a traffic problem, or it would alter the character of the area, that in and of itself could be a basis for denial of the variance. All right, next slide.
I have a question about
Sure.
that. Now this, I mean, it's maybe a general question. So the burden of proof, quote unquote, is on the applicant.
Yes.
Now we have to take what they tell us either in writing or when they come here and I guess determine if there's enough evidence. So for some of these, like this last criteria, sometimes they don't really touch on it in the sense that like no one has come forward to say, no neighbor has come forward to say, there's no, expert opinion that would say, this is really going to affect the whatever in Troy. It's just, there's sort of a lack of evidence.
Well, that's a good question. I think, go to the next slide. I think that kind of talks about this. A decision requires substantial evidence. So, like you said, if someone just touches upon something, the board may decide, well, yeah, there's evidence, but it's not substantial, and that's a call from the board. And so if somebody from the public comes up and says, if you grant this variance, I'm going to have a lot of traffic and I don't like it. Well, is that substantial evidence? It's probably not. And the interesting thing, again, the Pegasus case I mentioned in this, it indicates that a decision from the board can be based on evidence, based on comments from the public. But only if the board determines that the comments are not speculative or unsubstantiated. So yeah, if someone from the public says, you're using the same example, that's going to cause a lot of traffic and I won't like it. Probably not substantial evidence. Someone from the public comes up and says, I hired a traffic engineer and he did this study for me and look what's going to happen if you grant this variance. That probably is substantial evidence. So,
Or if they have some sort of anecdote.
Yeah.
Like, right now there's no traffic, but or they can point to a specific instance where increased traffic led to something that was.
It could be, yeah.
And then we have to kind of weigh it. It's really our function to kind of weigh whether something is substantial or not.
Again, the Pegasus case defines substantial evidence as something that a reasonable person would accept that evidence sufficient to support a conclusion. Again, that's an aspect of Pegasus that probably will remain even if it's reversed. So all of you are reasonable persons, and so if you think that what somebody is saying is substantial evidence, you can rely on it. On the other hand, if you think it's just a bunch of malarkey or whatever, you don't have to rely on it. All right,
Can I
we go.
ask-
Oh, yes.
Can I ask a question regarding the last one? Whether the proposed variance, it will be harmful or not. There are a lot of ors in that particular statement.
Yes.
So if one of them is satisfied, it's okay.
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of ors, you're right, yeah, so it doesn't have to be all of them based on that. If you're going to deny a variance based on altering the character of the property, you could, any one of those ors, increasing congestion, interfering with light, there's a whole bunch of them that you could choose from.
Okay, got it.
All right, next. I think we've discussed this a lot in the past. Technically, the variance should be the minimum variance necessary. If somebody could do something with a lesser variance, technically, this board can grant the lesser variance, and they could do it at the same meeting. But like you were asking about that one case tonight, one thing we can't do at the same meeting is we can't grant a larger variance than requested. And the reason is because the public has not been notified of the requests. I mean, so if you advertise that somebody's seeking a 10-foot variance and they come in and say, I really want a 15-foot variance, you cannot do that because there might be members of the public who saw the notice and said, oh, 10 feet's okay, but if they saw 15 feet, they might have come and objected. On the other hand, if they ask for a 10-foot variance and this board thinks a 5-foot would do the trick, you could grant the 5-foot variance. Next. You can impose conditions on the granting of a variance, but those conditions have to be reasonable and they have to be related to the land. What that means, again, it can't be related to the person who uses the variance. You can't grant a variance only if Mr. Smith continues to, live at the property, for instance, because that's not based on the property, but the person who lives there. The conditions have to be reasonable. There was some talk about Mr. Rathka, for instance, tearing down his house or tearing down a portion of his house. Now, technically, maybe you could have granted the variance and imposed that condition, but then you have to decide, is that reasonable to require a variance condition on somebody demolishing a part of their house? Some people might say yes. Some people might say no, but again, it's the board's call on that, whether it's reasonable.
So I have a quick question about that, I guess. How much should the board, say, bargain or negotiate with an applicant? If, like, how about doing this or how about doing that? You know what I mean? Like, is it sufficient for us to say, we think you could accomplish this, in say 5 feet versus 10 feet, as opposed to sort of getting into this back and forth with an applicant saying, well, what if you position the house this way? And we're not giving guidance and we're not negotiating like, it's their business decision how they want to, or how they want to handle the property.
It's kind of a gray area. It's like in one of the slides coming up, we recommend that you don't try to redesign their project.
Right, that's what I meant. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but on the other hand, making suggestions, well, have you thought about maybe what would happen if you put this on the other side of the house where you would need a smaller variance? That's perfectly okay to do that.
Yeah, what's stopping you, for example, for the person who wants to put their shed? I think somebody asked this a couple meetings ago. Well, you want to put the shed on the side, and we know you've got some features in your backyard, but what's stopping you from putting it here or here on the plan? And they said, well, nothing. Okay, well, you're not designing it for them, but they've said on the record, well, we can comply with the ordinance, and they were denied. I think that was last month.
On the other hand, it would probably be overboard if you pulled out your own plan and say, I did this, and I think you should do this. That's obviously something you should not do. But making suggestions or asking questions, I think is.
Well, and sometimes if they're denied based on just not negotiating, but just the questions that the board asks, they could come back with a different plan that maybe takes into account all the reasons why they were denied last time, and maybe it's substantially different so you could hear it again.
Okay.
Yeah, a year, 2 years ago, could have been 5 years ago now, we had a property that they had placed the house in property, and there was a triangle of the house that was over the setback line.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In their front corner.
Yeah.
And we were talking about chopping the garage as an option, if the variance wasn't granted. How do you define reasonable?
It's
That's hard.
It's up to you. You're the board. You have to determine if it's reasonable.
Because they could be compliant.
Right. So what I would say is if you're granting a variance based on a condition, the person making the motion should say, this is reasonable because, come up with something just to support why you think it's reasonable. So, and if you do that, it's probably okay. So,
okay.
Yeah. Next. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on use variances because we hardly ever have any. And when we do have a use variance, because they're unique, we usually provide you a memo going through it. But basically, use variances should probably never be granted. It's because the criteria is an unnecessary hardship. And basically, there has to be proof that you cannot even use the property as presently zoned, which is really a hard burden. It could happen, but it's, we hardly ever have that many requests, and when we do, more normally, it's difficult to prove. And it also requires 2/3 of the board to approve, which would be 5 people instead of 4 for this board.
So if the Pegasus case is upheld by the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeals decision is left alone, would that become the standard for a dimensional variance?
No, the Pegasus case would actually make it easier for people to get dimensional variances. Okay. Yeah, the Pegasus case says that the requirement that you show that there's a uniqueness with the property is only required if you have to show an unnecessary hardship. But you only have to show an unnecessary hardship if you're seeking a use variance and not a dimensional variance.
Okay.
So, we could probably go on the next one. We've discussed this in the past, but site visits are a good idea if you have the time to do it. You should go by yourself, because if you have too many board members showing at the same property at the same time, you could run into open meetings issues. It's not a good idea to discuss anything with the property owners. You should just say, keep to yourself, take a look at the property. If it's a residence, you should knock on the door and let them know you're there, maybe even call ahead of time. If it's business property open to the public, that's not such a big deal, unless you're going into a back portion of the property. And we recommend that you have some sort of identification, which I believe Paul could provide if you need it.
Yeah, just let me know and we'll make sure you get set up.
So, yeah. And again, that's more specific to private residential property. If you're just walking around, if it's a Walmart parking lot, that's probably don't need to worry about it too much. But if it's a private residence, which actually most of our variance requests are private residence, you should probably wear some identification. Next slide. We get administrative appeals now and then, but not that many. That's when a zoning official makes the decision, or planning commission makes a decision and they appeal. One thing that's different about administrative appeals is there's 4 standards, but in order for an applicant to reverse or modify a decision of an administrative official, they only have to show one of these things. So they have to show that the decision was either arbitrary or capricious, or it was based on an erroneous finding of a material fact, or it was based on an abuse of discretion, or that was based on an erroneous interpretation of the ordinance. So I guess the point I'm making is if you have an administrative appeal, we would probably give you a memo on that because we don't have that many, but you only had to find one of those criteria to reverse the administrative official. The one that I remember the most is the Monster Garage. Do you guys remember the Monster Garage? That was a case where our building official granted the permit for the Monster Garage based on his interpretation of the ordinance, and all the neighbors appealed, which they can if they have an interest in the property. And our zoning board reversed our building official, and then the owner of the Monster Garage appealed to the circuit court, and the circuit court reversed our zoning board, said our building official made the right call based on the ordinance. So, but I point that out because that was a long time ago, and I can't remember many other administrative appeals that we don't have that many, so.
So that first bullet, that means any decision by the planning commission?
Well, you know, there's a debate whether or not the planning commission is subject to an administrative appeal. We've allowed that before, because what the ordinance actually says is the ZBA has the authority to hear an administrative appeal of any official that enforces the ordinance. And there's actually some question whether or not the planning commission actually enforces the ordinance. We have allowed an appeal in the past from a decision of the planning commission to this board, though, so, but there's some people who disagree with that, but we don't have to worry about that tonight.
So which
Talk longer, son. I'm just curious.
which city of Troy departments and people would that apply to then?
Planning department could apply to any official who makes a decision under the zoning ordinance. The building permit is denied because the building official says that in the R1E district, you can't build this structure. The applicant says, that's not the way I look at the ordinance. They could then appeal to this board and say, if you read the provisions related to R1E, it does say I could build this structure. The building official was wrong and his decision was arbitrary, or it wasn't based on the language of the ordinance. And then the board could decide whether or not the building official was correct or agree with the applicant that, yes, he should have been able to get the permit to build in the R1E zoning, or whatever the argument is. So.
Okay.
The city manager is actually designated the zoning administrator, so whoever he delegates his authority to. So in some instances goes to the planning and community development director. Some instances it goes from that person to me, or from that person to the building official. But ultimately that sets the chain of command.
So we're the last one if they don't agree.
You're the last one.
Yep.
And then the circuit court.
Second to last one, potentially.
Well, then there's the Court of Appeals, Supreme Court. All right, next slide. This has never happened in the 20 years I've been at Troy, but technically somebody could come to this board to ask for an interpretation of the zoning map. And I guess this would occur if they're on the boundary of two districts and they believe that they're in one district as opposed to the other if you look at the map. If that occurs and you get an appeal based on the zoning map, then obviously there's criteria you have to follow that are set forth in section 4.03. So, like I said, do you ever remember? I don't remember ever anybody asking for one.
Once.
Once?
Once we were looking at, because we were getting measurements off of the master plan and off of the zoning map for one case.
All right. I don't remember that one.
And I was surprised we were able to get measurements off of the master plan because it's sort of more nebulous than the actual zoning map.
It is, correct, yeah. So, but a lot of I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but a lot of it is common sense. When you deliberate, you just, be polite, don't don't plan the project, we've already discussed that. But I think one thing that I like it, that you guys do this a lot actually, is when you're discussing whether or not you're going to grant or deny a variance, a lot of you will say before the vote that I'm going to deny this because it doesn't meet this criteria and that criteria. That's actually a good idea, because if there ever is an appeal, we go back and say, well, yeah, we had lots of findings and substantial evidence because board member so-and-so pointed this out. Oh, it's acceptable to ask the maker of the motion to clarify if you don't understand it, because it's pretty important that you know what you're voting on. And beware of body language. We tell you that because these meetings are on film, and whenever there is an appeal, we always provide the court with a video. And you never know, the judge might be looking at someone making a motion, and he's making weird faces or something, and the judge might say, well, they're clearly biased, right? You can tell by the way they look, so just be mindful of your body language. I don't know, is there anything else? Oh, use the templates. We were doing that a lot, because that makes certain that you will discuss the 5 criteria.
I think it's beneficial for the applicants as well, and that's one of the things I focus on when I first meet with an applicant, is the 5 standards, and I keep focusing in on that, so when we bring that back to the board meeting, it's something familiar with them, but it also shows that you're applying the standard that they understood from day one that you would apply.
Right.
So good for public transparency and confidence.
Yep. I think we could move on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's basically common sense. There's the Troy Board and Committee appointee code of ethics applies to all of you, but it's stuff we all know. Respect other people, don't use foul language, encourage the expression of opinions by committee members. I think I have another slide. Yeah, obviously prepare for meetings, avoid conflicts of interest. I suppose that I have actually a next slide on conflicts of interest. We're probably going on that. So conflicts of interest happen essentially if you have a interest in a particular property or application, it could be a conflict of interest. The general standard is if you're going to have some monetary effect as a result of the variance, that would clearly be a conflict. If you're great friends with the applicant, that's probably a conflict. But if you're just neighbors just have a minor relationship, it's probably not a conflict. You are free to ask your board members to decide the call. And if you think you might have a conflict, it's perfectly acceptable to say, to disclose your relationship and ask the board if they think there's a conflict. And if the board says, we don't think it's a conflict, then you're probably okay to vote on it. If the board indicates there's a conflict, then it's probably a good idea to excuse yourself based on a potential conflict. And we always recommend that if you do that, you go outside the door and then someone will get you when the decision is made. We do appreciate if you think there's a conflict, you notify us ahead of time for a couple of reasons, because we may be able to tell you whether or not we think it's a conflict or fault. But the other reason is if it's a possible conflict, we could make sure there's an alternative member to sit in for that meeting if we think you're going to be excused from that decision. So, all right, next one. We're subject to the Open Meetings Act. I think whenever there's a quorum of members together and you discuss any business, that could be a meeting. So I think what I'll tell you with regard to the Open Meetings Act is you should avoid talking to each other about a matter when you're not meeting in front of the people, because that could be construed as a violation of the Open Meetings Act. Whenever there's a quorum present of this board and you're discussing anything that might lead to a decision, it's technically a meeting. And if that meeting hasn't been noticed and made open to the public, then you're violating the Open Meetings Act. So, I think you go on to the next one.
So what, just going back real quick, what is FOIA-able for us?
Yeah, well, we probably go to the next slide for freedom of
okay.
information.
Maybe
Yeah.
come back.
You can stay there.
Okay.
All public records are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, which means anything that any of you discuss on city time or discussing city matters using emails is subject to disclosure. So that's why we recommend that if you get an email from a member of the public asking about a variance or something, we suggest you don't even respond. Or if you do respond saying, I'm sorry, I can't respond, instead you should send that off to Paul, and then Paul could share it with the rest of the group at a public meeting. But because anything you say in response, because you're talking about the ZBA meeting, is subject to disclosure. And so it's just better not to say anything, just ignore it. We could probably go on the next slide. All right, that's what I was just discussing. Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about the virtual meetings when we talk about our bylaws tonight, so I'm not going to talk about that at the moment. But an appeal from a ZBA decision is to the Oakland County Circuit Court. An appeal can be made by not only the applicant, but it could also be made by any aggrieved party. What happens when there's an appeal is we have to provide the court with the record, which is everything that's presented at the meeting plus the video. The court does not act as a super zoning board. The court just looks to see whether or not your decision was supported by the evidence. It's not arbitrary. It followed proper procedure. And even if the court disagrees with you, the court should affirm your decision as long as it's based on competent, substantial evidence and complies with all the laws. So, and again, the court could affirm, reverse, or modify the decision of this board. Did we skip some slides regarding motions?
No, I don't think we did.
It must be coming up.
Is there any after the?
Let me run through this again. I think there was one that we, I don't know if we skipped it. I don't think we skipped it.
I could have swore I did some sample motions.
There was one that said, that you went through quick, was deliberation and resolution.
Okay. Actually, Paul, I think this is an older version of, I think I did, all right. At one of the meetings, somebody asked us to do some sample motions, and I did some, and apparently they didn't make my PowerPoint. But what I wanted to point out is when you make a motion to grant a variance, and this is not on this, I thought I had it up here. It's important to, if it's going to grant the variance, it's important to raise all 5 criteria somewhere in the motion. I mean, there's different ways of doing it. You could discuss the criteria first and say, I think the applicant met these criteria, and go through each one, and if you could support your statement with something on the record, that's very helpful. For instance, I believe the applicant met the exceptional circumstances requirement because the survey that was presented at the meeting showed that this is a funny shaped lot. I also believe this is not of a personal nature because it's based on the shape of the lot, not the person who owns the property, and that based on what was said at the meeting. This is not a self-created hardship because there's no indication that the applicant did a lot split or did anything to cause the need for the variance. Based on the comments of the public as well as the information presented by so-and-so, it's clearly not going to cause a traffic issue. The point is, when you're making the motion for each of the 5 standards, if you could somehow point to the record, and sometimes it's pointing out to the fact that there was nobody evidence presented to show that criteria wasn't met. The point is, the more you could point to the record based on something, you know, maybe something staff said, something maybe a member of the public said, or if somebody brought in a professional based on what they presented, a document. For each of the 5 criteria, if you could demonstrate that there was something said or done at the meeting, or maybe even an email you received that supports why they meet that criteria, that's very helpful, especially when there's an appeal, because it's much more difficult to defend a variance grant than it is a denial, because on an appeal, we had to show the judge that there was substantial evidence on the record with regard to all 5 criteria. And we could say, well, Judge, as you can see by the maker of the motion, before he actually made the motion, he pointed out we have this criteria met because of that evidence, that criteria was met because of this evidence, and so on. If you go through all 5 of them and show that it's all based on the record, it just makes it more or less difficult to when somebody appeals the granting of a variance. Now, a denial of a variance is much easier to defend on appeal because, excuse me, because you only need to prove to the judge that there was substantial evidence that the applicant failed to meet just one of the criteria. So a denial is always much easier to defend on appeal. Obviously, when you make your motion to deny, if you could point out all 5 things were not met, that's great. But technically, if you could just show there's substantial evidence that the applicant failed to meet at least one of the criteria, that's very helpful. And I like to use the traffic study because it's just obvious that is substantial evidence. It's clear that this variance would cause substantial traffic problems based on the expert report of so-and-so that was presented at the meeting, and because of that, they have failed to show that this variance would not be harmful or alter the character of the area, and that, on that basis, I move to deny. The point being, as long as you could point to something on the record based on what was presented or said at the meeting, it just makes our job easier if there ever is an appeal to circuit court on the variance. And I actually did prepare some sample motions, but somehow they didn't make my PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. But any other questions regarding that? Yeah.
Mr. Matsney, is it possible at all for all of us to get a copy of those motion slides that you had created?
Yeah, okay. I will try to get those to you. Yeah, again, I think I must have put it in my PowerPoint, but sent the wrong one to Paul, is what I think I actually did, so what I will do is make sure I send that to Paul, and he could share that too.
Or maybe we could put it on next month or next meeting, maybe a brief
Yeah, sure.
miscellaneous item, if it's any questions about what you sent out.
Certainly.
Okay.
All right, and that's it, unless there's any other questions.
Any questions, anyone?
No, that was good.
Yeah, it was very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good reminder. Good additional info.
So, our second miscellaneous business item is, as Mr. Motzni alluded to, some proposed amendments, edits to our rules of procedure. And looks like Mr. Evans has it up on the screen. Again, I don't know if Mr. Motzni, if you want to walk us through
Yes.
some of the red lines that you're
So-
prepared for us.
So the one that was initially in your packet, I changed, and I'll explain.
Right. Yeah, you received hard copies in front of you tonight. Those were, Alan explained.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are different than what was in the packet.
Yeah, well, the first change was based on the fact that, and it's probably easier to look at the red line copy, but I did a clean copy as well. In provision 1, as you know, our old bylaws said that you had to elect a chairperson and vice chairperson in May, and that they hold office for 1 year. So what happens when you don't have a meeting in May? Do you have no chairperson? We obviously opine that you still have a chairperson, but to avoid that problem, what the first change would basically says is the chairperson and vice chairperson will be elected annually for a 1-year term, and that election will be in May unless for some reason there is no meeting in May, which could happen. If that occurs, then the people retain their chairperson or vice chairperson until the next regularly scheduled meeting, at which time the election will be held. So basically, it solves the problem that we had last month when we didn't have or 2 months ago when we didn't have a meeting in May. That one is the same as the one that was sent to you in the agenda. The next change, is there another change before that? Okay, the next change, it was 10 so when the Open Meetings Act was amended substantially, actually, during COVID, and it was amended to allow for remote or electronic meetings in all sorts of circumstances, basically. But most of those provisions were temporary, and most of them have now expired. So currently, what the Open Meetings Act now provides is that all members of this board have to meet in person, with only one exception. And that only exception that exists now is if the board member is on military duty. So if a board member is on military duty, then arrangements have to be made for them to participate if they choose to do so. And this essentially says that, because that's what this amendment says. If you're on military duty, you have to disclose at the meeting that you are participating remotely, but you do not have to disclose your location. So that involves the members. Now, the change that I made from the first draft, when I was here last week, I explained to you that when the Open Meetings Act still allows for remote participation by the public, but only if the board allows it and authorizes it. Everybody on the board said they thought that was a good idea, and I did too. So the first draft that I sent you that was in our packet authorize remote participation. The city attorney took a look at that and said she doesn't think we should do that, and very good reasons. One, city council is not allowing for, their bylaws don't provide for it. Secondly, if there's a problem with the technology and we're not able to provide the remote access, but we put it in our bylaws that we will provide it, then that in itself could be a violation of the Open Meetings Act, because someone could say, I relied on your bylaws that says I could have remote access and you didn't allow me remote access, and that's a problem. So I removed that part, and I did the same with regard to voicemails. Initially, the amendment would have allowed for people to participate by voicemails and would have required us to play the voicemails into the record. Again, the city attorney advised that the city council doesn't do that, and because of the same issue, what if we have a problem and are unable to play the voicemail? If you have it in your bylaws that you're going to provide it and you don't provide it, that could be a violation. Now, with that being said, it still allows for this amendment for remote participation by an email, and we provide that if someone submits an email comment, that it will be read into the record, which we generally do that. So that's 10. I guess, anybody have any questions on that, or?
I had a question.
Sure.
And you touched upon this just now. Sometimes if we have lengthy emails, you might not physically read the entire email aloud.
Yeah, good point.
Is that,
It's on the reader.
We could change that.
being cynical, I can see organized groups who may
Or
want to-
summary,
What that?
or summary, so we could read it or summarize.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Or could we say that, I mean, a physical copy of the email could be, do we add physical documents like that to the record? With like,
Become part of the record, so anytime we get an email, say it's not in the agenda packet,
yeah,
you get a hard copy here, but then we put it with the case file, so if there's
Right,
an appeal,
okay.
that goes to the
Yeah,
circuit court.
or we could even remove will be read aloud, but will be presented or summarized. We could change that. So.
Yeah.
Summarized,
Summarized would be,
or read or summarized. Give the options.
Read aloud or summarized?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask about that last sentence, though, when it says email comments may be limited to 3 minutes?
Well, that is if someone sends a 10-page email and it's going to take more than 3 minutes to read it.
So we just strike that?
We could
I guess.
strike that if we use summarize, we could strike that.
Summary or,
Right. So, strike that, okay. So with that being said, the way the Open Meeting Act reads about remote participation can be allowed if it's authorized. I think in a unique situation, this board could allow remote participation on a case-by-case basis if the board votes to allow it. But so it's still possible you could do it, but just by putting it in our rules of procedure, we're setting ourselves up for a problem. So like if it's a complex case where somebody has an expert that wants to testify from a different state, I think whether or not we provide this for our rules, since right now the Open Meetings Act does still allow participation by the public, I think the board could vote at that time to allow it for that particular case based on the circumstances, even though it's not in our rules of procedure.
So if a petitioner comes to Mr. Evans and says, hey, I'm up, or he calls in and says, I'm not going to be in town for my case, would you suggest we have the possibility of doing this electronically?
I suggest that even if we don't put it in our rules of procedure, I think on a case-by-case basis, this board could authorize it.
is that in Article 2.3, where a resolution supported by a majority of the members can temporarily suspend any rule
Right,
if that were to be a case-specific
be specific. but-
request or accommodation.
Quick question. If a petitioner is unable, disabled, or in hospital, hospitalized, and the case were to be, is coming up in front of us to hear, can they do a video petition?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Can the petitioner do a video?
Yeah, I think,
Can they do it if in case they are physically not able to come for whatever reason?
I believe this board could allow a video presentation, sure, certainly.
Because just recently we had a gentleman in a wheelchair. I can just imagine how hard it is for the family to put him in the van and to get him here. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. Is
Yep.
that a possibility for them to do?
Yes, that would be a possibility. I don't think that would violate the Open Meetings Act.
Okay.
Because as long as the board allows it. But the point the city attorney made is you don't want to put it in your rules that you're going to allow it, because then that's where you run into the problems.
What are the nuts and bolts of how we do this? Do you just like give a disc to Mr. Evans and he plays it? Or a thumb drive, or do we do WebEx?
Yeah,
I mean, Skype?
I've never even considered that until it was brought up just now.
Okay.
but, yeah.
'Cause I know we've done videos in the past where they had like presentation slides where they hand you the thumb drive.
Probably.
So that's an extra complexity, is the nuts and bolts.
And ultimately, if we had a question about it, we could always ask the board, what do you think of this?
Yeah, it's just the difficulty of us you don't have us as a board until the meeting starts, and you need that beforehand.
Yeah, the other challenge with that is there's trade-offs sometimes with everything. Then you can't have that discussion that you might want to have, or maybe there's additional questions that you're not able to ask, or you can ask them, but maybe they won't get answered until the next meeting.
Then the last set of changes proposed is on the last page, procedure. It's just a grammatical thing. The procedure before referred to chairman, I just changed that to chairperson. So, and that's consistent because we use chairperson in other portions of the rules, so it's just to be consistent with the rest of the rules. So that's, unless there's any questions, you made the one change. I mean, we could present a clean copy with the one change, or you could probably vote on it knowing what the change is. I'd leave that up to you guys.
I have 3 additional changes for the last page to consider,
Okay.
since I have gotten to read this.
Is this the procedure
For quite-
document?
yeah.
you're referring to?
Yes, page 5. So at the top, the first line, zoning board of appeals, a group of 7 of your neighbors appointed by city council. I always want to stick Troy City Council in here, just because we're televised and more clarity. Because there's a lot of out-of-town developers that are here and builders. I don't know if it's not necessary, but I just think it's more clear. And then the first line under procedure, the board will hear the items, they appear on the agenda. But when I read this, we haven't approved the agenda yet. So I'd like to add in front of the word agenda, approved agenda. That way because one time we changed the agenda to make the order different, right after I had read this statement. So it would read, the board will hear the items in the order they appear on the approved agenda, for clarity. And then the last one is the one that may need to get some more wordsmithing. It's the petitioner has the right to request a delay, or instead of right, The petitioner can request a delay in hearing their case if there are not 7 members seated to vote.
You're adding that as like a fourth paragraph?
Yes, just to make it clear. And that would be irrelevant when we've got 7 members sitting here, unless one of us gets disqualified because of a conflict of interest and we haven't prearranged the alternate.
So request postponement if less than 7.
Yeah, so the petitioner can request a delay or a postponement, yeah. A postponement
If there are,
in hearing their case if there are not 7 members seated to vote. And we should probably say 7 zoning board of appeals members.
okay, so what I would suggest at this point is not voting on this
Review.
tonight. And it's actually probably a better idea because we'll have a full board maybe next meeting. So what I will do is revise these. I'll send them to Paul, and then hopefully we'll have a clean copy or a revised copy and a clean copy for the next meeting, because that's what I would suggest.
I would agree with that. I think to the point about the remote, we just talked about, the city attorney had maybe an opinion on that, for the board, which I think was helpful. If there's any, I guess, wordsmithing from the city attorney and/or any, I guess, guidance on how to best maybe phrase it, or I think we would appreciate that.
Okay, good idea.
Okay. Put this on next
So
agenda.
then we'll defer the final or proposed revisions till our next meeting, August or whenever that would be.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
I had one more quick question for the city attorney, and this is actually going quickly back to the FOIA issue on the presentation. And I don't want to nitpick this, but so we get handouts, when we come here on a monthly basis. Are we required to retain that for our, it's going into the file, but it's given to us. Are we required in some way to hold on to it, or are we allowed to get rid of it and throw it out?
Certainly hope not.
I don't know. I just don't want to run afoul of the FOIA if for some reason we're asked for because I don't think any of us retain any physical records that.
No.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying. Okay. Well, I think we're completed our miscellaneous business. Thank you for Mr. Motsney for your hard work on the presentation and working on the rules of procedure, and for our board members with their input. At this point, we'll move on to item 8. Any public comment from members of the board? Anyone? I don't think there is any. So we'll adjourn the meeting, and I don't know if there's business already lined up for August, but maybe we'll see you in August, or maybe.
I'll make sure to let everybody know this week. I've already got a note on my things to do tomorrow to just confirm my belief that we don't have any cases for August, but I have to double check before. And
Okay.
if that's the situation. I'll have Jackie send something out soon with you so we can all plan.
All right, thank you.